Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Now, continuing our broadcast as World Watchers, no longer Dialogue Conspiracy. I don't really know why I changed the name, except that I think World Watchers is more significant at this time. It's number 328, and it's June the 16th, 1978. I spent the last week, 2 hard days, reorganizing my library. I used to have my books on assassinations of John Kennedy in chronological order, starting with the very first year that John Kennedy was killed. Afterwards, Joe Joestin wrote a book, Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy. And I thought it would be interesting for historical purposes to put them in the chronology with which the critiques surfaced and what kind of information they came out with. But that's impossible to find when you get really busy, so I had to break the books down into the order of the author and put them in alphabetical order. I have enclosed for you a sheet on the library sections of my research so that you can see the categories of books that I have, and these sections run anywhere from, say, 180 books or 190 on the Warren Commission, on the criticism of the Warren Commission, or defending it, whatever, anything that's been written about the assassination of President Kennedy. Not his policies, that goes under the historical section, under the 60s and 70s, but just on the evidence of the conspiracy or no conspiracy. There are many in that section, and also the next largest section, or equally as big, is the one on government agencies, on the CIA and the FBI and intelligence operations. My library now has each of these listings with the cardboard dividers separating them, and the books are divided into the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, George Wallace, the Manson family, Ted Kennedy, and the Chappaquiddick affair, and Malcolm X. Now, everything in those categories, in those 6 categories, is complete. That means that everything that's been published on those subjects I have, and if they're out and I don't have them, then I don't know about them. I want to keep this library intact for future generations, and I don't want to have half the books or be accused of being selective in what I read. Therefore, I have everything on that subject. Then there's a long shelf about 9 feet long with political deaths, what I call political implications, such as Kent State or the Algiers Motel or the airplane crash of Amelia Earhart or the killing of Bruno Hauptmann, the charges of killing the Lindbergh baby, and possibly assassinating the wrong person for that crime. My political deaths go from A so far to S or V, Algiers Motel, to Sacco Vanzetti. As I say, the books on the intelligence system include those that are listed, the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, ITT, and so forth. I have a section on narcotics, drugs, and organized crime, the Watergate. Watergate alone is 20 or 25 books, and the hearings before the Senate Select Committee. I have the hearings up to about volume 1 to 12, and at 19 and 20, I missed the ones in between. I ran out of money, and I think I have to order them soon, and I hope that they're not out of print. The mind control section, books by Jose Delgado on the physical control of the mind. That's an older one up to a new one that came out just this month, War on the Mind by Peter Walston. The history books are broken into 4 categories with dividers in between the Civil War up to World War I, the conspiratorial parts of it, the things that are of interest to me that show up later, the 1914 to 1945, from the breaking of the Versailles Treaty to the end of World War II, and then from 46 through 50, that 4-year period that set the groundwork for the Nazification of the world, when the CIA was formed with General Bedell Smith, and where Allen Dulles had the role of financing and organizing Adolf Hitler's chief of intelligence, Reinhard Galen. He set the network as the deputy director of the CIA to set the Nazi network with their unlimited counterfeit money all over the world and American money besides. Those 4 years were the key to what's happening in Africa today, the Middle East today, and affecting our lives. Those were the very important years. And then the 60s and 70s, the years of the Vietnam struggle, Reverend Moon, riots, assassinations, as I said above, books on certain countries, such as death of democracy, the overthrow of Greece in 1967, the turning of various countries into Nazi governments, that history from the 60s that we're living through presently, that goes into that category. Books on NASA. NASA was formed by the Nazi space scientists Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger, war criminals that should have been hung at Nuremberg, and then NASA was headed by Vice President then Lyndon Johnson, who worked with NASA, and books on the faking of the moon landing. The banking section, Who Rules America, The Rich and the Super Rich, Do You Really Want to Be Rich? Books on corporate banking profits and the money men. Prison systems. Not only do I have people like George Jackson under the deaths for political implications, but the letters of George Jackson, the story of American prison systems or prisons around the world. Books on justice. Those are the things to watch, such as in Germany, because it was Seymour Melman's book that describes how the courts in Germany stopped working and the people who were guilty were outside functioning and the innocent many times were locked up and the court trials didn't work. And these are by famous authors or about them, such as F. Lee Bailey, and critiques of the justice system as it exists. Books by and about the Fourth Estate, exposés of Drew Pearson, Jack Anderson, various movie scandal writers like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, and then a section on the occult and magic and mystical, the Illuminati, the Thule Society, secret societies. There's one section on UFO books. I don't have very many of them. I have more magazines and articles. I don't have any definitive, really good books on UFOs, but I have other sections of magazines and work on that. The religious conspiracy goes into the conspiracies of the Vatican, the Jesuits, the Mormons, and the CIA, government collusion with religion. There aren't too many books out associating religion with assassinations and conspiracies, but there are references to these people in articles and magazine articles, but I do have some books, about 8 or 9, on the religious aspect of the conspiracies. And then I have this one wall, it's about 9 feet wide, maybe longer, maybe 11 feet, and I have bibliographies up at the top going from Agnew to the Warburgs, and in between famous personages, Howard Hughes, just the name here doesn't indicate how many books. I have every single book that's been written about Howard Hughes. I don't know of any that I haven't collected. And then there's books of Richard Nixon, books about Alger Hisk, Whittaker Chamber. These are in alphabetical order. I had trouble whether to put them into the Cold War section, into the 50s, the trials, or whether to put them into the bibliographies. It's very hard to know when you're trying to put this amount of work together. And then one section on radiation or cancers or poisons or virus, like mind control, physical problems and physical conspiracies, and then one on oil conspiracies, plutonium, oil, mineral. There are books coming out now talking about the various oil conspiracies and the ripping off of certain minerals and commodities on planet Earth, and those go under resources. I think it's important for people to know the classification that I separate for research and how I come to some of my conclusions, the sources of my information, and hopefully in time I'll be able to have a printed flyout of the material, the books that I possess in each one of these categories, so that some of you can cross-reference or refer to that material or look up these books yourselves in the library if you want to do that. If we follow the same reasoning, the same line of thinking of how we see the world, or at least how I've seen it through my research and have come to certain conclusions, then by listing these categories, you can follow it more easily, and I think that's important. In the next few weeks, I'm going to separate my filing cabinets and reorganize those into subject categories in a more systematic way than when I originally started. Again, they are all clogging up together, and the cross-filing is impossible because I don't have a team or an organization here or a computer. But after I get the major categories of the filing system separated, I'll spend the next few weeks after that separating the amount of newspaper articles that are not filed, and hopefully by the fall be ready to just sit down and write some books and articles and concentrate on reaching a larger master of the printed word. One of the most important books in my library has to do with the Nazis, the overriding theme of my research. It's called Galen, Spy of the Century by E.H. Cookridge, written and it was published by Random House in 1971. It was written by Mr. Cookridge. And there are parts of that book that explain what is coming down now. If you read that book and study it, then you can understand the headlines of 1978 or 79 or 1980. I wanted to just read with you a couple of sentences from the beginning of the book and then jump to one section called Friends of Egypt and Israel on page 352, 353, which has to do with Allen Dulles, Reinhard Galen, and the Nazis in the Middle East. The book begins by saying that Allen Dulles, in 1947, helped charter the Central Intelligence Agency. He wanted, in quotes, to create an effective intelligence agency, and we must have in key positions men who are prepared to make this a life work. The agency should be directed by a small but elite corps of men with a passion for anonymity and a willingness to stay at that particular job. We must find that their reward is primarily in the work itself. Now, these silent men surfaced at Watergate like they had never surfaced before. If you were fired after the Bay of Pigs invasion, when John Kennedy called off the invasion of Cuba, and names appeared, spy masters such as Allen Dulles, although he was pretty public as a spy master all along. But after Watergate, we learned of the names of Robert Mayhew and E. Howard Hunt and William Buckley and James Angleton, and then Mr. William Colby, of course, was running the Phoenix program in Southeast Asia. But these were pretty low-key people until Watergate, and then their names really surfaced. Allen Dulles had worked with the Central Intelligence Agency for 16 years. He was the head of it for 11 years. He was removed from being director of the CIA by John Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs because Kennedy feared this hidden government. And as soon as John Kennedy was murdered, Allen Dulles was put on the Warren Commission to handle all evidence of the conspiracy that involved Lee and Rena Oswald. Not the physical evidence of the homicide, but the conspiratorial aspects. Allen Dulles was appointed originally by President Eisenhower to set up the Central Intelligence Agency after he had been in Germany in 1944, 45, 46, working with the heads of Nazi intelligence and Nazi generals and government officials, even during the war while our men were dying. And then he was to come home and head and start the Central Intelligence Agency on the recommendation of his very own brother, John Foster Dulles, who at that time was Secretary of State. Eisenhower was weak and war weary, and he was described in a book called The Captive President, kept in the White House as a symbol, but all statesmanship and decisions of the Cold War policy and the reconstruction of Germany were under John Foster Dulles, along with his brother Allen Dulles. The CIA was set up to inform us about other countries that might invade us, such as the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Actually, its purpose was to protect the multinational corporations that couldn't defeat communism during World War II in Germany and began to set up the conditions by which they would get ready for World War III and the Fourth Reich by ensuring that these Nazis set up this network. In the book, Galen, Spy of the Century, Cookridge refers to General Walter Bedell Smith. He was a military general. He was the first head of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1950. That was the year of the Korean War, of the testing of our military with Nazis in getting a foothold in Southeast Asia. To Walter Bedell Smith, head of the CIA, came his deputy director, Allen Dulles, and Mr. Cookridge said, we must give them the palm or the hand for laying the sound foundation of which the great network of CIA stations throughout the world is built. Allen Dulles succeeded Smith as being director of the CIA. He began to devise foreign policy himself, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion, and President Truman had to say then, in quotes, the CIA has been diverted from its original assignment and has become a policy-making arm of the government. Truman said he was always against the building up of an American Gestapo, even though President Truman, was the one who hid and stop the investigation of the Nazi money in the Swiss banks, form the National Security Council, and let Mr. Oppenheimer's atomic bombs be dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It was Allen Dulles, according to Cookridge, who gave the post-war career of Nazi General Reinhard Galen the initial impetus, without which Hitler's former intelligence chief would never have reached the powerful position of eminence he had in what was left of the free world. Galen's chief sponsor after World War II was Allen Dulles, who was an attorney for the Rockefellers and the large corporations. Dulles took over Hitler's intelligence operation and duplicated it in forming our National Security Council. Cookridge said Dulles provided the vast finance that Galen needed to turn it into the largest, most efficient espionage machine in the Western world. I'm mostly quoting here Cookridge, but the forming of the National Security Council is an insert of mine. He says, in quotes, Dulles guided and encouraged Galen and protected him. Dulles enabled Hitler's agent, chief of intelligence, Reinhard Galen, to become the head of the Federal German Intelligence Service in 1956, which provided 70% of NATO's military intelligence. So if NATO is telling President Carter that the government of Russia is stronger than us, that the embassy is getting radiation from the Russians, that the Russians are falsely imprisoning certain people that aren't spies, that the Cold War is becoming a hot war in Europe as it is today, these are Reinhard Galen's men who are continuing to feed this information about Zaire, where the Russian rockets are supposed to be, not the Russian, I'm sorry, the German Nazi rockets are in Zaire. It is those people that are saying the Cubans are there. Other officials are saying the Cubans are not there. The Nazi intelligence operation is completely in control of the bulk of material coming out of NATO and going into the hands of the presidents of the United States. Reinhard Galen, according to Cookridge, applied strict rules. He was conditioned to obey authority unquestionably. By 1946, working for the Americans, he had already given a quarter of a century to the Weimar Republic and then Hitler's Third Reich. Galen gave 25 years to them and 50 to the Central Intelligence Agency. Well, it's not quite 50 yet, from 45 to 78. It's not quite. He'll have an anniversary soon, but that's many years with the American intelligence community. He had an obsessive single-mindedness all his life, according to Cookridge. The vital need was to resist communism at all costs, even if America becomes fascist, I might add. His goal was to stop communism. He resolved at the end of the war to change his masters and work for the USA in his crusade against Stalinism. Galen was anonymous. He was lonely, withdrawn, self-effacing, didn't make friends easily, needed no public acclaim. To Reinhard Galen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, his positive aim was always a mean to an end. So if you see Newsweek on the stands this week with the sickle and Mr. Brezinski and the call for another war, remember that Mr. Brezinski is one of Reinhard Galen's agents, put in there by the Nazis, stirring trouble against Russia. Even if it bankrupts this nation, even if it ruins this nation, these foreigners have to head our Social Security, National Security Council, not Social Security, and take over our foreign policy to serve the Nazi spy masters that we fought in World War II. First we financed them, then we protected them, and now they're getting ready for another route. In the book, Galen's Spy of the Century, he's got a section here on Egypt, which I'll read to you, parts of it, page 352 and 353. And maybe this will whet your appetite, and you'll check this book out of the library. It said, when the British government decided to contract out of Egypt, the United States took over as the world policeman and moved in. In 1951, Allen Dulles sent one of his leading Middle East experts, Kermit Roosevelt, into Egypt. He had already accomplished difficult assignments in Syria and Iran. And if you read the book, Do You Really Want to Be Rich?, it talks about Kermit Roosevelt disguised as a missionary with machine guns under his robe, helping to kick out Mossadegh to put the Iranian government, the Shah of Iran, into power. He had served the CIA in Syria and in Iran, so they sent him to Egypt to King Farouk, who they described as hopeless, and they wanted to take over the control of Egypt. Now, Israel had been made a country by the United Nations and the governments of the world after the Holocaust in 1948. So in 1951, it became necessary to put into power a charming young colonel by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who belonged to Hitler's Bormann Brotherhood, who was an agent of Reinhard Galen during World War II. Now, they put Mr. Nasser in, they eased out King Farouk. King Faisal was to die later in Saudi Arabia. They eased out King Farouk and put in Nasser, and they had a great relationship going with him. He immediately imprisoned all of the leaders that he associated, in quotes, with the Communist Party, but the purpose was a Nazi takeover of Egypt. And then the Americans began to shell out $40 million a year into Egypt's economy in order to support Mr. Nasser with intelligence. Cookridge says that Nasser then needed men to organize his secret service, to direct his espionage, and his training saboteurs against Israel. Now, this is in 1951. Israel was made a country in 1948, and the CIA then took over in 51, and they brought in top Nazis to direct their activities against Israel that had only existed for 3 years. Those Jews hadn't suffered enough, and Mr. Nasser of the Bormann Brotherhood didn't want a Jewish country right next to him, so the CIA came. Cookridge said they brought in their advisor, the American advisor, turned to Reinhard Galen and told him to recommend qualified people to sabotage and train against Israel. So they took his experts from Pulak. He had several men who were doing espionage against the British during the war when the British were fighting the Nazis. So the CIA brought in people that had fought the British, our allies, in a war in Libya, Egypt, and Iran. They fought our very allies, and we brought the people we were fighting in as the advisors. We brought the Nazis in to help sabotage Israel and other countries in the Middle East, and even the people that were fighting Britain were not war criminals after that bloody war, but were brought in for the job. Reinhard Galen suggested his colleague, ex-SS Secret Service Sturmbannführer Otto Skorensky of Zeppelin fame, and he took on an assignment in Egypt. After the war, Skorensky had spent 3 years in American captivity in Germany as a suspect war criminal. He was released in July 1948, 2 months after Israel was made a country, in May of 48. He had been living in Spain. He was a prosperous engineer in the engineering business. They told him that he would get a salary larger than Nasser's by the CIA. By the United States government would give Skorensky a larger salary than the president, the head of Egypt. Then Allen Dulles and Reinhard Galen, Hitler's intelligence chief, approached Skorensky's father-in-law, the notorious Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, who was Hitler's financial wizard, who was acquitted at Nuremberg, and he had an 8-year sentence which was squashed during the denazification program and the laws, and he had become a bank president in Dusseldorf. And so they took on Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, a close friend and associate of Clay Shaw, who later worked in New Orleans with regards to the assassination of John Kennedy. Here they were getting the Mossadegh out in Iran, and Farouk out of Egypt, and soon Kennedy out of the presidency of the United States. Skorensky worked in Egypt for a year, and then he left Nasser's Secret Service in the hands of other SS, Secret Service, and Gestapo men. He recruited 50 of them to come to Egypt, who had gotten safe hiding in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Spain, where their safe haven from Allied persecution as war criminals had protected them, and now they could be put into use in the Middle East. Among his assistants was a high official of Goebbels' propaganda ministry and Heinrich Himmler's RSHA. His name was Franz Bunch, B-U-N-S-C-H, an expert on Jewish matters. He had worked with Adolf Eichmann on the final solution during the war. He wrote a book on the sexual habits of the Jews that's supposed to be the most vicious pornographic document ever produced by the Nazis. The German intelligence in Cairo looked to Reinhard Galen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, for advice, and he appointed a liaison officer for them. He sent him from Germany. He was a bird of the same feather, according to Cookridge, an SS officer from the Gestapo, Deputy Reich leader of the Hitler Youth, Mr. Hermann Lauterbacher. The German-led Egyptian Secret Service achieved little against Israel. This is what Cookridge is saying in 71, which I don't believe at all. He goes on that they fomented that Suez War, but it managed to foment much mischief in Arab countries and other Arab countries. The Egyptian Secret Service engaged in subversion intrigue in no fewer than 6 Arab countries during this period. And if they did it during that period, those Nazis are still there doing it now. And you can see why none of the Arab countries want to coexist with Israel, even though that piece of land, which is only the size of Los Angeles County, is progressive and isn't hurting anybody in the Middle East. The Nazis have instigated in every country through the SS and the associates of Himmler and Heydrich and Eichmann to never be satisfied until Israel's erased. That is the promise of these oil people to these Nazi chiefs in exchange for their agents, and sooner or later they'll do it. This book says that the BND, which was Galen and post-war German intelligence, never relinquished their interest in the Middle East. They set up several residences, which was their Polock term for their foreign branches, equivalent to our CIA stations in Arab capitals. In 1958, Galen was involved with Nasser, with some of Nasser's enemies, such as King Saud of Saudi Arabia, whose secret service he modernized. And Reinhard Galen brought in radio communication system for Saudi Arabia. The Nazis set that up for them, and then the king had given him a jewel-encrusted sword, as well as fees to the Galen men. In the Cairo residency of Nazi intelligence, the BND, Reinhard Galen sent one of his senior officers, 35-year-old Gerhard Bosch, B-A-U-C-H, the stepson of Galen's vice president. When Galen had his large operation, Galen's vice president was the stepson of this man, Major General Hans Heinrich Werditsky. Mr. Bosch lived in Cairo. The cover was that he represented the Quant Corporation, Q-U-A-N-D-T, which is heavy industry in Germany. At Damascus, the BND, those are the Nazis, set up residence with an ex-SS man from the Hauptsturmfuhrer, Alois Brunner, B-R-U-N-N-E-R, alias working over in the Middle East by the name of George Fisher, who posed as the director of a German-Syrian trading company. Brunner later joined Bunch in Cairo. They had been old colleagues. They worked under Eichmann in the RSHA Jewish department. You can see that the concern that I have, that I felt repetitious on KLRB, but I can say it over and over again on these tapes, is that the network of the Nazis that resettled with unlimited money, unlimited agents in this Galen operation is the explanation for what is happening in America and the world and around the world today. And it's a large organization. They call themselves a spider, the Odessa. They have the cooperation of every president of the United States with the exception of John Kennedy. It's funny because Joe Kennedy was brought home as ambassador from England because he seemed too pro-Nazi, and J. Edgar Hoover felt that there was too much information to make him suspect, not to keep him there any longer. But Joe Kennedy's son, John, broke some of the rules when he fired Allen Dulles and when he wanted to expose the people behind the Bay of Pigs operation and wanted to call a halt to that kind of multinational grab for organized crime that was working down in Cuba. Kennedy broke the rules. In the book, Galen's Spy of the Century, on the back of the book, on the fly cover, it describes a little bit about Galen. From an obscure officer, he rose to be Hitler's chief of intelligence against the Soviet Union. Reinhard Galen infiltrated spies into Stalin's war council and encouraged Stalin to kill some of his best friends and told them they were enemies. He organized the werewolves, the young people who were to carry on the tradition of Adolf Hitler. He worked with Heinrich Himmler, the man who set up the concentration camps, with Meyer Heydrich, who formed Interpol, Hitler's police system, and began conceiving the idea of the final solution for getting rid of all Jews in the world. Reinhard Galen worked with General Vasilov and the White Russian Army of Liberation. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, members of the Galen operation and the Vasilov's army appeared as friends of Lee and Marina Oswald, and that's how I happened to hit upon them when I was doing my research. Certain people such as Valentina Ray, Igor Voshinin, Mrs. Voshinin, Elena Hall, Alex Kleiner, Ilya Mamatov, Anna Meller, and many others I don't have time to name. Our time is running out because these tapes get cut off. They're not always the same length. So I'll stop now before we end in the middle of a sentence. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's June the 16th, 1978, tape number 328. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 329, June 16th, 1978, side 2. On side 1, I talked about Reinhard Galen, chief of Hitler's intelligence, taking his agents, his Nazi agents, into Egypt with Mr. Nasser, overthrowing King Farouk and setting up Nazis, at least 50 that they admitted, and many, many more besides, from Latin America and South America that escaped prosecution at the time of the Nuremberg trials, and putting them into Egypt. And I mentioned also that in 1948, the Nazis began to move into Egypt 2 months after Israel became a country, in July of 1948. And the important thing about studying this past history and reading these books, the kind that I have in my library that you can get at libraries and bookstores and so forth, is that you cannot understand the present headlines, you cannot understand the news of today or predict tomorrow unless you study the past. The past is gone with all of its blunders and mistakes, but only through reading and studying and putting aside a lot of the frills and entertainment can you sit down and concentrate to put these pieces together. Jack Anderson had an article in the paper this week, a syndicated column, which goes into the rearming of Saudi Arabia, one of the countries mentioned as the recipient of Adolf Hitler's agents. And it tells how Mark Siegel, President Carter's liaison advisor on Jewish affairs, recently left his work with the White House because of the decision to send F-15s to Saudi Arabia. At the time, the defense argument for sending them there was that they were defense airplanes, that they needed them to defend themselves probably against Israel attacking Saudi Arabia and so forth. Now it seems that the report of the purposes of the F-15s and the nature of them has been concealed. The party who claimed that they were defensive weapons said that she never really implicated that that's all that they were used for. They also had said originally that Tabuk, the airport where these F-15s would remain, was a civilian airfield, and now it seems that it's much more than a civilian airfield. The airfield is being upgraded for not only for the F-15s, but for airplanes that are very dangerous to the security of Israel. Tabuk Airport, in quotes, is heavily protected by American Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, and the Hawk triads are currently being installed. The United States is helping the Saudis to construct them. There's a modern paratroop training installation there, and there will be barracks for them and for several thousand paratroopers. Jack Anderson said that McDonnell Douglas, who make the F-15, said it is a potent and legal strike airplane as well as an air superior interceptor. So while President Carter talks about human rights and decency in the political field and covers up his selling of airplanes, it all boils down to the fact that Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the Nazi countries in Egypt as well as South America are combining their agents and their talents and are full-scale intent on wiping out Israel. And in exchange, we'll be able to get our oil probably at a decent price someday. They've as much as said that in recent statements. A man who's helped fight Nazis in America, and what I call the Nazification of America, is Sherman Skolnick in Chicago. Pardon me. I've given you his address and his telephone number. He's easily accessible. He's a brilliant, courageous person who has been separated from the bulk of the researchers, such as Mark Lane and Harold Weisberg, Sylvia Marr, the very people that protect the Nazis in the conspiratory aspects of the assassinations, particularly those, and who malign the other researchers who get into the field of Nazi and call them crazy and isolate them, have put Sherman Skolnick in the category of benign neglect. I get the same treatment from them, and I know why, and I wonder why they're protecting these Nazis unless these researchers are up front covering the real story, which I think is the real story of the assassination of John Kennedy. Kennedy's murder wasn't any different than replacing Farouk or Mossadegh in Iran, one in Egypt, one in America. As I began to study the assassination, I realized it was just a chain of commanders or head of states that had to be gotten rid of if they didn't go along with the game, the political game that we're getting into every day. Sherman has a list of books, a series of them, that you can send for the bibliographies. One is called Nazi War Criminals in America, The Secret Story, and he has listed about 20 excellent books that are available at the library, are still available if you want to order them or read them. He also has information on the fatal plane crash of Dorothy Hunt at the time of Watergate, the bag woman. He had his agent Alex Bottas, who happened to be at the airfield working for the Drug Enforcement Agency at the time, catching the little pieces of the conspiracy and then putting it together on how Dorothy Hunt was killed. And he's done excellent work on the Chicago riots in 1968. He's one of these people who's made allegations that Tom Hayden and Abby Hoffman and various persons involved were agent provocateurs that were set up and disguised for the New Left in order to get these conspiracy laws that people couldn't go through the 50 states in order to assemble or protest against the government, to try to keep you in your own state. A lot of the left don't like Sherman Skolnick because they say, how dare he say that about our leaders? But it is the left that's infiltrated. The right doesn't have to be, because they're already sympathetic to the cause. And if you read Philip Agee's book, Inside the Company, it's the left labor parties, the left newspapers, or offices, or political organizations that you have to infiltrate and sabotage, because there's no reason to waste your agents. You don't infiltrate the John Birch Society, you infiltrate the Yippie or Hippie Party. And he's been put aside and ignored by very good, otherwise good researchers because of the Nazi connections. So write to Sherman, and because of postage expenses and paper expenses now, send him anywhere from $1 to $2 for a bibliography or a printed sheet on the plane crash of Dorothy Hunt, the Nazis in America, and the Abraham Bolden story of the plans to kill John Kennedy in Chicago. That's another reason why I think Sherman is so much ignored by some of the very so-called researchers, Robert and Sam Anson, who wrote They Killed the President, and many of the writers, the almanacs that have come out, have ignored him because he did this extensive work on the plans to kill John Kennedy in November of 1963 in Chicago, and we know there were plans to kill him in Miami the same month. And of all three of these attempts, the one that succeeded in Dallas and the other two were exposed, the links would go higher up and high up in government and not down to Fidel Castro or a handful of displaced anti-Castro Cubans who went out on a limb on their own and killed the president unbeknownst to the Attorney General, the FBI, the Dallas police. That story never will wash, and it's just all wrong. But the way you keep it going through all these various committees in Washington, D.C., is that you say it often enough and it becomes to sound like a truth, and the truth is that the Nazis have been behind this. Just as I gave you a list of books that I categorized in my library, I will be in another 2 weeks giving you a list of files, and the way I cross-file my newspapers are the way I should, the subject categories, so that some of us who share these tapes may begin to put information in the same kind of an order. Sometimes people have a feeling about different subjects but don't know how or where to put it. So I will send out a printed sheet for you and discuss on the tapes way to save information, because once you have it, it's there. Once it's out of your hand, you can never go back and get it. It's very, very hard and time-consuming. So it's better to save more and not be quite sure what you want now than to throw it out and look for it later. Sometime I would like to write a book on how to do research and put information together and save it, because the same principle applies to one type of investigative work as to many, many others, and once you catch the principle, you're on your way, and you can begin to put meaningful articles away for your children or for yourself or grandchildren or for me, or copy them and share them with other people who are specializing in those areas. And maybe we could build up a network of people who are observing what is going on, have nowhere to put it but can share it with others. There's one woman I mentioned before, Marge Gibson, who lives in Minneapolis, who sent me 2 large packets of conspiracies in St. Paul and in Minneapolis and in the state, Minnesota, and they're filled with information. And what I have to do always is take it. It should be cross-filed. One, the Minneapolis connections, which she's put in envelopes, and the other is in the other sections of mysterious murders, people that got out of jail that should have been locked up, evidence of mind control, corruption in government, the new Hubert Humphrey a memorial group that's being set up there. Who's on the board of it? It looks like a CIA front. Who are the members? Where do they come from? What will the front be used for? Will it be like a Stanford Research, another CIA front in Minneapolis? We have to take this material and have a general system of classifying, which I can spend the time doing now when the tapes were a half hour a week. It was very difficult to do this. Now that we have an extra half hour, we can go into organizing, and I will be doing that. And I also will get out the list of the books that I have under those major categories so that you can keep up with those. One of the most valuable books I have in my library under the category of American history that falls into that period, that Cold War period after World War II, the 1946 to 1950, is a book that you should have. It's called the Hoover Commission on Organization of the Executive Branch of Government. It was published by McGraw-Hill, and the date isn't on this, but it was published, it was currently in 1950. It was pertaining to 1950 and the passage of the National Security Act. The commission, this preceded the Warren Commission, was made up of Herbert Hoover, who only happened to have $2 billion in 7 oil companies and minerals and various products in the Tsarist Russia before the communists took over. It was Herbert Hoover who took hundreds of millions of dollars of money that was supposed to go to Europe to food relief program and gave it to a white Russian Polish army to rearm, to get ready for a global war against the Soviet Union, to step up the war after World War I. And they did give us World War II and the Holocaust and the 80 million deaths and displaced persons. Dean Acheson was on this commission. This commission was ordered by President Truman to reorganize the executive branch of the government. And this is an important book because this is where we lost our Constitution and our control of decision-making policy. James K. Pollock was on the commission, John McClellan, Arthur S. Fleming. I don't know if he's related to Ian Fleming, whose grandfather was over here after the Civil War reconstructing the banks, whose father was a member of Parliament, extremely right, conservative member of Parliament, and then Ian Fleming, who worked with the OSS and formed our Central Intelligence Agency and the North American Newspaper Alliance, that later had links with Lee Harvey Oswald and Priscilla Johnson. I don't know if Arthur S. Fleming is related to them, but I have to look that up. James Forrestal was on the commission and later was written up as one of the first tests, Hugh MacDonald said, of mind control at Bethesda Hospital when he jumped out the window at Bethesda Hospital. And then Joseph P. Kennedy was on this commission, the Hoover Commission, on reorganizing the executive branch. Now, Joseph P. Kennedy was brought home as ambassador to England because, according to J. Edgar Hoover, they had tapes and recordings of him as being pro-Nazi, and they felt that he was too un-American to serve as the ambassador to England. And he also worked with Cardinal Cushing in Boston with the Cold War propaganda against Cardinal Brezinski in Hungary. He was always an instrument of the Cold War. He was very pro-Nazi, and it would be interesting up in heaven or wherever they are for pro-Nazi Joe Kennedy to bump into John Kennedy, whose very agents, his father's very agents, had killed his son. But even the Nazis snitched on their parents or children if they felt that they weren't consistent with the main political system. Well, the Hoover Commission report was set up by none other than J. Edgar Hoover, and of course the year is interesting because the President of the United States was seduced into forming a new kind of government. As the preface said, it was necessary to reorganize the federal government, and agents were greatly excited, and there was much public interest. A commission was formed on organizing the executive branch of the government, reorganizing it. The executive branch of the government had never been reorganized until after World War II. And in speaking of common sense business, they attempted to solve by their commissions and executive orders and legislation problems that had to be turned over to a new group of people. Mr. Hoover set up this commission with a recommendation signed by Herbert Hoover, again, the man who had $2 billion in 7 oil companies that were confiscated by the Tsarists. And he's going to set this up after the Nazi form of government that took place from the illegal rearming of Germany after Versailles Treaty and worked for Adolf Hitler until he was elected. Herbert Hoover said, 5th of February, 1949, Dear Sir, this is to the President and the Senate and the House of Representatives, in accordance with Public Law 162, the 80th Congress approved on July the 7th, 1947, the Commission on Organization of the Executive Branch of the United States Government. It relates to the general management of the executive branch, and this was the organization that was to take away what our Constitution meant about the balance of power divided between the executive legislature and the Congress. The balance of power in the Constitution was soon to be taken away by this executive order of the National Security Council. Now, this letter was written February the 5th, 1949. Prior to World War II, when it broke out, Adolf Hitler was corresponding with Nazi Germany, high-top Nazis, until the day we were invaded by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. And then he went on to become vice president of Interpol, that was originally founded by the Nazis. And in 1946 to 1950, Herbert Hoover was vice president of the dreaded Nazi organization that conducts its international affairs today, known as Interpol. They recommend to Congress that we should reorganize the executive branch of government. The policies of Congress, it is hereby declared to be the policy of Congress to promote economy and efficiency. Therefore, we must eliminate duplication and overlapping of services and activities. We must consolidate services and activities and functions of a similar nature. We must abolish services, activities, and functions not necessary to the efficient conduct of the government. We must define and limit executive functions and services and activities. The writing and the adoption of the federal Constitution, this is what the Herbert Hoover Commission said, proved that a republic could deliberately analyze its political institutions and redesign its government to meet the demands of the future. This is what it said, that the original Constitution allowed for them to do this. As I say, J. Edgar Hoover was vice president of Interpol, and Herbert Hoover was setting up the organization of the National Security Council. As a result of depression and the war and new needs for defense and our greater responsibilities in the foreign field, the federal government has become the most gigantic business on earth. In less than 20 years, their employees rose from 570,000 to 2,100,000. The Commission has found that the United States is paying heavily for the lack of order, lack of clear lines of authority and responsibility, and lack of an effective organization in the executive branch. Much can be accomplished. Many of the most important things can probably be accomplished only if Congress reenacts and broadens the power to initiate reorganization plans which it previously granted to the President under an act which expired March 31st, 1948. The Commission recommends that such authority be given to the President and that the power of the President to prepare and transmit plans of reorganization to Congress should not be restricted by limitations or exemptions. It does believe that the safeguard against unwise reorganization plans lies both in a sound exercise of the President's discretion and the reserved power of the Congress by concurrent resolution to disapprove any proposed plan. Limitations or exemptions upon this power to reorganize should not be imposed other than that of congressional disapproval. And then the general management of the executive branch goes on in the introduction. The President and under him his chief lieutenants must be held responsible for the people for the conduct of the executive branch. Responsibility and accountability are impossible without authority and power to direct. The exercise of authority is impossible without a clear line of command from the top to the bottom and a return line for responsibility and accountability. The wise exercise of authority is impossible without aids which staff institutions can provide. And these are the aids that the National Security Council begins to advise. The aids we get by forming the National Security Council as it exists today are the men that tell President Johnson that we are being bombed, the Tet Offensive, that our ships are being attacked, we have to escalate the war in Vietnam, information that practically all of Cuba has to be in Zaire fomenting the war, and yet this congressman saying to President Carter, prove what you are saying. And he says, I don't have to prove it to you, the CIA tells me. The National Security Council becomes the advisor and gives the orders from the top down, from them to the President to the Congress. And it's important to know that the laws for putting this into order by Herbert Hoover and J. Edgar Hoover and the proposed laws for redirecting the government were made after World War II, when the Nazification process became necessary, when the British Empire was being broken up, when our financial holdings in all these various countries could be jeopardized, and it was necessary to make a law which was described in detail. It's called the Hoover Commission Report, published by McGraw-Hill, and it goes into the formation of the National Security Council. And I think it's interesting that Herbert Hoover, that old dog who got us into trouble during the terrible Depression because he was sending these millions of dollars to the white Polish army, and it was all wasted except it was used for a network of spies later. I think it's important to follow how that National Security Council got started, because that was the beginning of the end of the American Constitution as I see it. I don't know how many of you read Midnight on the newsstands. I read it because I write for it, and they do a good job on my articles. They never cut anything out. They're very fair. June 20th, 1978 has an article which I thought was rather interesting. It has to do with various psychics, 5 psychics who went down to Miami with Malcolm Abrams. He's the gentleman that I work with my articles. And they were supposed or alleged to have talked to the ghost of Bing Crosby, John Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, and Freddie Prinze. These are called Messages and Pleas from the Grave, and Elvis Presley. And some of you may take it tongue-in-cheek, but there was an interesting item in there which caught my interest, and I just thought I'd pass it on to you. The person who was talking to Marilyn Monroe, this psychic, Valerie Morrison, and also Frankie Avery, were receiving messages. This is their story, and it's written up for Marilyn, that she had a diary, that there's a secret diary, and that they killed me, she said. They killed me, and she is desperate. She's supposed to be desperate, and she's talking about the injection which she got, which you don't have to know through a psychic. She did have a needle mark in her arm when she was found dead. But she said, whatever happened to my diary? Did you take it? Do you know where it is? It has never been found. Someone has it, and there is much written there about so many people that's shocking. Careers would be destroyed, and what did they do with my diary? Did it fall in the wrong hands? And she went on and later said they lied and lied about what happened. Now, that caught my eye because about, 16 months ago or so, a man came to me who had Marilyn Monroe's diary, and he was frantic. He was a good friend of hers, and he was with her just before she died. And she told him that she thought that a certain party, a man who's in Hollywood, who's a writer, who had a very close relationship to her, was going to kill her. She was deathly afraid of this person. He had helped her out early in her career, and he was hanging around. And she thought that she knew too much about what was going on in Hollywood, and that there were intimations that she could be killed. So she told him to keep this diary, and the man's name was in it. And he came up to Monterey. He was staying at the San Carlos Hotel. I had no way to protect him, or I didn't know which way then to turn with the diary, and I gave him the name of a well-known writer in New England who I trust. I have 3 or 4 of his books, and felt that maybe this would be the best place to be. Then when I went down to Hollywood last year to work on a book, I met this man that she was afraid of, and it was really a shock to me to find out that he had some association with the book that I was working on. And the man is armed, and he had a gun. He always carries a gun, and has close links to military intelligence and the Howard Hughes organization and a network of spies around the country, the kind that did or could or would want Marilyn dead. I haven't heard from him since. There's several or many people that have contacted me at various times, and I let the chance pass by. I was supposed to meet Saul in Canada. Hugh MacDonald wanted me to meet him. And, you know, a man called me who had done these 10 assassinations for the CIA and went out to do another job a year ago this September, and I haven't heard from him. I've had some interesting experiences that maybe I should have gotten closer to, but for whatever reason, instinctively or so forth, I didn't want to pass the buck, and I do go up over my neck on a lot of things anyway that maybe I shouldn't be saying or doing. But wherever I feel comfortable, I get into something, and if I feel threatened, I pull back. It doesn't matter how big the story. I called Malcolm at midnight and told him about the story. He said, find him. I mean, you could make a huge fortune, and Midnight National Enquirer pay small fortunes for these kind of people and information. I guess I'm just too dumb to commercialize or make money off of this thing yet. I don't know how. I don't think I ever will. I play it instinctively, as I say. But there is this diary. I know it exists. I believe the man. And he was frantic. He had the same kind of frantic description that was described in the seance. And some of you may take it tongue-in-cheek and pass off these things. I never did believe in psychic experience or ghosts until my own daughter was killed. And then things happened in our own home that were deposited or rearranged, and then came back and reappeared. And then I had to reevaluate my own feelings about what was happening just to me. And I don't know about you out there, but I've been very much tuned into following things ever since that, because they're still happening to us. And there is no explanation. This is called psychic phenomena because it is phenomena, and there's no way to categorize it. But there was that diary, and the man did come through, and if ever he comes again, we'll follow it through. I think I'm better prepared to handle that kind of material now, and we'll follow it through. One of the regular subscribers, longtime subscribers to my tapes, who sends me a lot of material that I've mentioned before from Minneapolis and St. Paul, also mails me many articles on the UFOs and magazines on UFOs. While we're talking about psychic experience, I can get into that briefly for one more minute here. I put on a reference book from the show May 26th, the book UFO Nazi Secret Weapon. And just to continue along those lines, as I say, we just have a minute. In the UFO magazine, Official UFO, September 1977, it talks about the Earth nuclear UFO fleet, and it says that UFOs have been around a long time, but never so much as since World War II. There have never been so many in the sky, and that they think that after the atomic bomb explosion in 1945, there began to be a large number of these UFOs seen. And it goes into, since the 40s, they have given evidence of being very highly radioactive, and it explains that there's reason to believe that they cool off, they're very hot, and that they are seen going into water or underwater, and it says the UFOs have a heat problem, and therefore they could stay in the Arctic and Antarctica, where temperatures are 100 degrees below zero. This is quite common, and it could explain the reports of UFO bases in northern Sweden, Finland, and Antarctica, because they would be cooling off down there. And when you think of the route of that I suggested from that one book, the UFO Nazi Secret Weapons, that Adolf Hitler went from Denmark to Norway and then down to Antarctica, and I think of Sweden as the headquarters for the Nobel family, the oil interests, and the links to the Nazis and the Tsars continuously after the Tsar was kicked out of Russia and the communists took over. Some key questions about the Nazification of the world. These first ships, the tankers that Aristotle Onassis got, came from Sweden, and then he was importing and exporting oil on these large cargo planes that remained an Argentine citizen. I think pinpointing these UFOs to the Antarctica and to Sweden and down to that area, is the Arctic and Antarctica, is very interesting. It goes into the heating of them and the nuclear reactors that could be on them and the development of them since World War II, how many billions America's put into this. This particular article, Official UFO, as I say, it came out September 1977, and whether you believe in them or don't believe in them, you better begin to study some of the material that has come out if you really want to know some of the missing pieces of the puzzle. And I think the use of these type of UFOs and cattle mutilations is important and does link to neo-Nazi groups and spreading terror in this country. So I try to put, maybe it's too big a puzzle that I'm trying to put together, but there's certain areas on the map that I have circled and marked, and as we go into the way to do research or the way to look for certain symptoms, we'll get into those. I think studying the body politic of conspiracies is like studying science. If you want to be a doctor, you can start with general anatomy and biology and so forth, and then you can pinpoint certain areas that, where there's fevers or blisters or sores or types of sores, and you look for certain symptoms like temperatures and rashes and runny nose, or the body has certain symptoms for certain diseases. And I think the conspiracies aren't so broad that they encompass every single thing there is in the world, but they can be narrowed down to certain cities and places. Houston, Texas is a key one, Miami, Muscle Shoals, Alabama, Columbus, Ohio, Dayton, Ohio. There's certain cities where the Nazis were sent, the scientists were sent, the agents come from, their particular lawyers are trained. And once we pinpoint those cities, like they're doing with cancer, they're trying to find a cure for cancer now. There's cancer houses where everybody who moves in, unrelated to each other, seems to get cancer. There's cancer neighborhoods in large areas. They've studied certain pockets of an area have cancer and others don't have it at all. So when you find a